Good morning or afternoon, everyone, as the case may be, and welcome to the Sentinel Innovation Center webinar. I'm Jen Nelson. I'm from Kaiser Permanente Health Research Institute in Seattle, Washington, and I'll be moderating today's session. For those who are new to the series, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's Sentinel system helps address questions related to safety and effectiveness of marketed medical products. The Sentinel Innovation Center is focusing on developing innovative methods to further advance Sentinel by leveraging new data sources, building new tools, and enhancing real-world evidence capabilities through advanced analytics. We've launched this seminar series to engage experts and innovators in key areas related to the Innovation Center's master plan. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mark van der Laan. Dr. van der Laan is the Jianping Su and Carl E. Peace Professor of Biostatistics and Statistics at the University of California, Berkeley. He's developed the targeted maximum likelihood methodology and general theory for superlearning. Dr. van der Laan is the founding editor of the Journal of Causal Inference and the International Journal of Biostatistics. He's authored 4 books on targeted learning, censored data, and multiple testing, authored over 300 publications, and graduated 50 PhD students. He's received many awards for his innovative work in causal inference, statistics, and machine learning, including the Committee of Presidents and Statistical Societies Award, the Mortimer-Spiegelman Award, and the Van Danzig Award. The title of Dr. van der Laan's presentation is Targeted Learning, the Bridge from Machine Learning to Statistical and Causal Inference. Before we get started, I just want to mention that your lines are muted, and so if you'd like to pose a question, please type it into the Zoom question and answer feature, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the session. And last, this session is being recorded and will be made available through the Sentinel webpage, which can be found at sentinelinitiative.org. So without further ado, Mark, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I can share the screen. Let me see. Okay, I think this would be it. Can you guys see my screen? Oops, sorry.
Yes.
Yes? Okay, and it's large enough? Okay, good.
Yeah, it looks good.
All right. Okay, yeah, so thank you very much for attending this lecture, and thank you for the introduction, Jennifer. So yes, this talk is about targeted learning, the bridge from machine learning to statistical and causal inference. And I apologize for the slide, still not completely updated, but otherwise ready. Yeah, so to start with, why is there any need for a new type of statistical methodology, which is what I will talk about today. This is targeted learning. And one of the motivations is that the traditional toolbox for statistics is very recipe oriented. You know, the typical table might be that it states the type of data, and for example, you have a binary outcome, and then the recommendation, depending on if you care about regression, you would say run a logistic regression, and if it is a continuous outcome, you use linear regression, and if it isn't survival time, then you run the Cox proportional hazards, if it's, and so on. And so there's a lack of communication here with the collaborators and the scientists, as if somehow the type of data is going to tell you what the right methodology is and what the right question is and what the assumptions are you will need to make. And so that obstructs the real communication with statisticians we should be involved in, which is understanding the experiment which generated data, thereby obtaining that knowledge, and also understanding what the real question of interest is and how we can formulate an estimate which is best approximate that. There's also serious problems with traditional regression methods, even when you accept them as something to answer some questions, they have the problem, like for example, if you apply them in an observational data analysis for estimation of an, let's say, a causal effect of a binary treatment on some outcome, let's say you run a logistic regression and you put in your confounders, then you will have the problem that your coverage of your confidence interval will, as sample size large enough, will converge to 0. And that's due to, even when you have all the confounders measured, that's because of model misspecification, because you will only adjust for the confounders, for example, through main terms or that type of thing. You will probably, many people actually avoid putting in interactions with treatment because that causes other problems. You have to look at multiple coefficients. So all that means you're not really adjusting for the measured confounders, and therefore what you're fitting is just the bias. And so even when the effect is null, you will actually find something, and similarly the confidence interval will start centering around something which is wrong. And that's both true for the type 1 error as well as for confidence intervals. So you have that the claimed statistical inference in terms of type 1 error and confidence and coverage of a confidence interval is just plain not true.
Mark, can I interrupt just for a moment to ask that you put the PDF in full screen mode? We had a request from one of the attendees.
Good. Let me see. Window.
There should be an option under the view tab. Yep.
Let me see. Is this better? Let me check. Or is this worse?
I'm seeing a blank screen now.
Oh, let me see what's happening. View. So I'm trying to use the full screen mode, but you're seeing that you don't see that well. Let me see. One more time, I try this. So this you don't see well, right?
Yeah, all I see is a black screen. Maybe as an alternative, we could go back to the other view and just close the margins on the side there. So if we click on the X next to bookmarks.
Let me see.
At the top left.
Top left?
Yep, just down a little bit from
this one. This
bookmarks. Yep, and then over on the right, we can close that margin with that arrow that's between the slide and the margin there. Perfect.
Is this a little better?
A little bit better.
All right, let me see. Okay. I thought there was a, okay, all right. So is this doable or is it?
Yeah, I think that's better.
All right, yeah, so the other problem is that many times these models are fit, you know, in an interactive way, including human intervention, and thereby there's a lot of searching because yeah, if you're just a priori specify these models, you don't know what you get. They're they're mostly misspecified, so you might not like the answers, and there will be a kind of iterative effort to end up with a model which seems compatible with what your kind of scientific sense tells you. But in the end, that is not really statistics. You're not letting the data speak. It is more you're using these tools to obtain what seems sensible to you. So that's often referred to as post hoc model manipulation. This is, of course, a recognized thing by many. There's early on, John Ioannidis wrote publications such as Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. And there are other articles like False Positive Psychology, Undisclosed Flexibility in Data Collection and Analysis that allows presenting anything as significant, and The Statistical Crisis in Science by Gelman and Token. So how does targeted learning fit into this field? Targeted learning carries out a roadmap which takes into account all the advances which have been made across many fronts, in particular causal models, so structural equation models or the name and Rubin type models, which is really essentially models which define desired full data, random variables, like in causal inference, defined in terms of hypothetical experiments. And so they allow you to define these counterfactual outcomes, potential outcomes under different interventions. And then you recognize that in the observed data, you only see one of them, right? The one corresponding with the treatment the person actually took. And more general in sensor data, and we often have a combination of both censoring as well as the causal challenge. you have to, on top, you have also censoring, right censoring, for example, or that type of thing. And so these are models which allow you to define your causal quantity of interest. And also, like in a world of where there's no censoring, and that essentially you will be able to observe the outcomes under different treatments. What would you want in that case? Now, for example, you might care about an average treatment effect as an example, or the average treatment effect on survival at a particular time point, like the survival at 1 year under treatment minus the survival at 1 year under control. So that's then something you have to then formulate as your causal quantity of interest. Then comes the identification. Can we identify from our observed data experiment that quantity? Now that is a challenge, because you have to deal with the fact that you have censoring and missingness, and it's informed by potentially by time-dependent covariates. And so there's a lot of work going into that. Is what kind of assumptions do you need to be able to go from the probability distribution of the data, which is what you can learn, to this quantity you care about. And so that's where we have things like the G-computation formula, right? The sequential randomization assumption, which defines then an estimate which equals that causal quantity, such as the average treatment effect, under specified assumptions, and such as the randomization assumptions, and typically you also need a positivity assumption. Now that means at that point we have defined our estimate and representing, and essentially your estimation problem is now defined, where you also have to take into account what you really knew about your probability distributed data, what was known. Like in a randomized trial, things are known. You know how the treatment was assigned, and maybe there are other things known, but typically very limited. And so your statistical model, which is a set of all possible distributions, is very large still. And so the statistical estimation problem is then to estimate that estimate based on this statistical knowledge you have. And that becomes then a pure estimation problem. Potentially there's still the causal gap, but that has nothing to do with estimation. That has to do with the identification assumptions not holding. That's where we say we want to utilize the state-of-the-art in machine learning, such as we have promoted Superlearning based on these theoretical foundations, which is just ensemble learning, where you use cross-validation to choose between many machine learning algorithms, including parametric models. And that gives you then a good way to estimate the stochastic relations between your observed variables, such as the probability of something happening at the next time point given the past. And that's great for learning that whole conditional density and across all the different nodes in your among your observed variables, let's say ordered over time. But it's not yet good enough for your particular feature of the data distribution, your estimate, which is mapping this whole fit of the density of the data into a single number. And so that is much more sensitive, has a very different bias variance trade-off relative to learning a complete prediction function. And that's why we need an additional step, and that's called the target maximum likelihood step. So that's where the targeted learning comes in, which does tailor this superlearner fit. It updates it, but in a way that it becomes, that when you now plug it into the estimate, it actually gives you an estimator which is approximately normally distributed and has bias which is negligible, and therefore allows you to do statistical inference. So that's the overall, essentially the roadmap of target learning to answer statistical and causal questions with confidence intervals. And that's why you can think of it as the bridge from machine learning to statistical inference. Now, target learning has been around now for quite some time. It started in 2006 with a paper on target maximum likelihood, and lots of contributions from many people by now. And in particular, 2 books have been published, also incorporating contributions from various people working in this area. A more recent book is Targeted Learning in Data Science, Causal Inference for Complex Longitudinal Studies, and the earlier book was Targeted Learning, Causal Inference for Observational and Experimental Data. There's also a lot of software development going on. There's this TL-verse and SL3 environment now we are building, which will also come out with a book, like a handbook, where we show how to use these software tools to analyze all kinds of data set. data sets. There are also, of course, been many applications by now throughout the literature, also in high-profile journals, such as the New England Journal of Medicine, Peter Gilbert's group has been using it in various problems for genetic diversity and protective efficacy of the malaria vaccine. The SEARCH trial, where we evaluate the impact of community-level interventions on the HIV epidemic, using superlearning and target mixed likelihood even for small sample size with great benefits. Here's a paper by Sherry Rose on variable importance analysis for medical conditions for healthcare spending, contrasting the typical methods used, like linear regression or logistic regression based, and finding quite different findings and some very significant different versus the targeted learning approach to assess the impact of medical conditions on healthcare spending, and so on. And it's also used for solving very complex problems, such as here a paper by Romain Neugebauer based on Kaiser data, where you have longitudinal data of diabetes patients, and they're followed up over time and monitored at irregular monitoring times, and you are wondering what kind of dynamic treatment regimen would be best for controlling the glucose level of a diabetes patient. So now you want to understand what would survival have looked like for this population under different dynamic treatment regimens for controlling glucose level. Like, do you start intensifying treatment at glucose level 8 or 7 or 6 or 5 or 6.5? And so you have these four causal treatment counterfactual survival curves you're interested in these, and you want to compare them. And this was done, and you see a contrast between the four survival curves if you use sophisticated target learning, and find actually that aggressive intensification is the most beneficial for survival and other time to event outcomes. Okay, so let me go quickly through more detail about this kind of roadmap thinking. So this involves multiple steps. You describe the experiment. You specify your likelihood, right, of the data, and what you know about your likelihood. You define the statistical query, your estimate. You define an estimator, which is an a priori specified algorithm which maps the data into a number. And then you have to specify how you get your inference. In other words, how do you estimate the sampling distribution of your estimator and thereby construct confidence intervals. We'll do a running example. This is an example by Romain Peraccio, who was interested in reanalyzing 3 multinational randomized trials assessing the impact of steroids on mortality among septic patients. This was an interesting problem. The medical doctors thought that these very sick people who come in with this septic infection, that giving them steroids might be beneficial for them and give them a higher chance to survive. And so they carried out a lot of randomized trial comparing just giving antibiotics versus also adding the steroids. And none of these trials was able to find a significant finding. In fact, even a meta-analysis across 32 trials did not discover a significant benefit for taking the steroids relative to not, even though that was kind of counter the medical science understanding. So here you can think of the data as, N 1,300 adults, IID data. On every subject they come in, you have their history, their covariates, you have some number of biomarkers, so some stress test in particular. There is then the treatment which is given, and then there is the 1 month mortality, just a binary outcome. So we have this WAY according to time ordering. And so you could start writing down the likelihood as according to the time ordering as the density of W times the conditional of A given W and Y given A and W, right? The propensity score, the treatment mechanism, and the outcome regression. And now we need to say, what do we know about them? What do we know about the distribution of the covariates? What do we know about the conditional probability of treatment given the covariates? What do we know about the conditional probability of death as a function of the treatment and the covariates? And in a statistical model is supposed to be only making assumptions which are known to be true, so that the set of possible data distributions you allow, which is drawn here, should contain the true one. And on the other hand, if you start going for something like a logistic regression, you create this very small class of data distributions which excludes the true one, and therefore you are starting to operate in a wrong world. So that's the difference between a realistic model, and in our case, we would only assume that we know the randomization which took place across these 3 trials, and that's how far it goes. Then you have to define your estimate. That's where you go through the causal models. For example, you might assume this Neyman-Rubin model or the structural equation model, which allows you then to define for every subject these potential outcomes under treatment and control. And you say, I care about the mean of y1 minus the mean of y0, just as an example, but there might be other causal contrasts you're interested in. And then you say, okay, can I learn that from this data? Now for that, we need the randomization assumption, which will be true here. And so you can then show that the average causal effect is equal to the following estimate, where you calculate the probability of death for every strata. So for every, in a way, member of your population, you calculate the probability of death under treatment for that person and the probability of death under control for that person. You take the difference and you average, right? So in other words, it's a strata-specific conditional treatment effect averaged over all the strata. And that then equals the average causal effect under the assumption which we know to be true here. So that now we have defined our statistical estimation problem. We know what we want. We know what we know about the data distribution. So now we need to start constructing an estimate. Now, if you're just looking at the estimate, you can see what you need. You need to estimate the probability of death as a function of the treatment and the covariates. And then you have the average, which is just an empirical mean. So that's the easy part. But nonetheless, we do have to estimate this probability of death as a function of treatment and covariates, even though we don't have any kind of parametric form we are aware of. So that's where we then use this target mix and likelihood estimation, which is a 2-stage procedure. The first stage estimates the density of the data, in this case, the probability of death given the treatment and the covariates. It happens to be that you actually should also estimate the other nuisance parameter. It's a propensity score because that's part of the targeting. So we construct estimators of both. And for that, we then recommend superlearning, building a library of algorithms and let them compete through an internal competition so that we can see who is the real winner in an honest comparison. And we choose then that one as our candidate algorithm so that for different data sets, it chooses different algorithms, and that makes it a very adaptive procedure. And then we use that as our offset in the targeting step. And the targeting step, in this case, corresponds with running a logistic regression where the outcome is death, the indicator of death. And the offset is the logit of your superlearner prediction of death, given the treatment and the covariates. That's a function of the treatment and the covariates. So it's like one of the columns you will create in your data matrix. That's the offset, and then you have a single clever covariate, which is in the indicator of treated divided by the propensity score minus the indicator of not treated divided by 1 minus propensity score, and that is then the clever covariate. And then you run a univariate logistic regression. So you fit the coefficient in front of the clever covariate, and that gives you an updated superlearner, the update of the superlearner predictions for every subject, and in particular under treatment and control. So you can then, for every subject, take the difference of these predictions under treatment and control, which are now targeted predictions, and you average over your sample, and that gives you then your estimate, your plugin estimate. Now that's TMLE. TMLE is a plugin estimator. It's efficient in the sense that if you do a good job on both nuisance parameters, the outcome regression and the treatment mechanism, like getting an n to the quarter kind of rate, which we can get with highly adaptive lasso, so we can include that in the superlearning, then we are guaranteed asymptotically efficient, and they're really extremely small assumptions, like only finite variation assumption. And because of the plugin property, it's also finite sample robust, significantly more robust than, for example, estimate equations or one-step estimates. So this was done actually by Romain Paraccio, and so he reanalyzed with TMLE these 3 big RCTs, and because of the fact that it now gains efficiency, which it's able to do, right? In these previous analysis, people were just taking difference in proportions, but now you can actually use the covariates, which are very predictive because it's only the outcome is only 1 month away. So you have good covariates which are very predictive, and therefore you will gain efficiency without any risk, because the targeting step takes care that even though you do fancy machine learning for your outcome regression, the targeting step makes it completely unbiased estimator because of the fact that your G is known, your treatment mechanism is known. So in this way, we get a narrower confidence interval and thereby find actually a significant effect. However, if you really see what's really going on in this data set, you would, this is actually just a point that what you can see, that's also what you can test through simulations, that if you, that the difference between the initial estimator, that has a sampling distribution. And if you do TMLE, it changes the sampling distribution, it shifts this towards the target estimate so that it becomes centered correctly. But also actually, depending on your initial estimator, many initial estimators don't have a normal sampling distribution at all. It's only because of this case we use actually highly adaptive Lasso, which is essentially already maximum likelihood, so it's very normally behavior. Then it just shifts it. But in general, you might actually end up from an initial sampling distribution of the initial estimator, which is still very far from normal, and then it becomes normal because of the targeting step, approximate normal. So what happened really in this data set is that there are two groups. There's a stress test, the responders to that stress test. The steroid is bad, and for the non-responders, it's actually good. And that's how we, so that's why it was actually challenging to estimate an average treatment effect, because it's averaging a positive and a negative effect for different parts of the population. And so what you, for example, could have done here, you could have a priori specified a machine learning algorithm for learning the optimal rule that would find that there is this binary variable, which is really changing the treatment effect from negative to positive. And so that would recommend a rule. And then this could all be a priori specified. This is actually what we do. We have algorithm, we have software for that as well. So that this a priori specified Superlearner for learning the optimal rule would learn this and then automatically say, okay, now my question of interest is the mean outcome under this rule versus the mean outcome under control, which will be just using antibiotics. And then we do the TMLE of that. This is done in a so-called cross-validated TMLE, so that it's corrected for the bias due to using the data twice. Once for learning what your question is, knows what's the rule you're interested in, and then also using it to actually compute the estimator of that statistical estimate. Now that's, if you would have done that here, you would have actually found a very significant result, and you would also have discovered what the right way of treating is these patients. This gets, of course, then into precision medicine. And all this can be done. And this is an example of TMLE for data adaptive target parameters. Okay, now I want to end with some foundations of, firstly, Superlearner. Is, of course, the key ingredient. So what that is nothing else than building a library of candidate algorithms. For example, you might include in it linear regression, Bayesian regression trees, random forest, neural networks, Lasso, highly adaptive Lasso, you name it, splines, all kinds of parametric models you can incorporate. And then you say, let me, for example, you use it for prediction. So like, for example, learning the outcome regression. You train these algorithms on 9/10 of the data. And then you say on the left out subjects, let's see how well it actually predicts according to your loss function, which might be log likelihood loss, it might be squared error loss, whatever the right loss is for your problem. And then you can do it in a 10-fold way, so that every observation appears once in a validation sample. And then you evaluate the average, like squared error, average log likelihood across the validation sample, and then also average across the 10 sample splits in validation and training. And so this gives you the cross-validated risk, right? The cross-validated measure of performance of the different candidate estimators. And then you can say, I'm choosing the winner. And you can choose just the winner, or you can choose the best weighted combination, which is, means you're looking at a larger library. You're not only looking at every algorithm as a singleton, but you also look at your real collection of candidate estimators is all the convex combinations of these candidate algorithms, and you then might end up with a selection which says I'm going to use 2/3 Hall, 1/3 BART, and whatever, 1/6 GLM. Superlearning is theoretically grounded by the so-called Oracle inequality for cross-validation, and so it is proven that it's asymptotically optimal, it's asymptotically equivalent with the Oracle selector, which would be the selector which actually knows the truth and then chooses the algorithm based on the 9/10, which is closest to the truth. And so that's, of course, not even an estimator, but that's it's an oracle estimator. And you can prove that the performance of Superlearner, in other words, using crossfade to select among candidate estimators, is asymptotically equivalent, not meaning that it's not only getting the same rate of convergence as the oracle estimator, but also up to the constant, right? So the so-called risk-based dissimilarity for the oracle select estimator and the truth divided by the risk-based dissimilarity of the Superlearner and the truth, that ratio goes to 1. And that's a very strong result. So Superlearning in practice, so Superlearning is not just a theoretical thing, it's really something which wins competitions. The most competitions which have been done have been won by these type of algorithms, ensemble algorithms. And you can also see here is an original study done by Eric Polly, which was looking at like 15 data sets with sample size from 300 till 500, and running the Superlearner with this library of algorithms, which is stated here, and seeing who is doing the best. And then you can see the average across the 15 is what gives the ranking. It's all relative, mean squared error relative to GLM. So smaller than 1 is good. Bigger than 1 means you're worse than GLM. And you see the Superlearner is the winner, which is based on convex combinations of candidate algorithms, and discrete is just choosing the best. It's the second, and BART is third, and so on. And the thing to note here is that something like BART, great algorithm, there's one data set where it does poorly, and then of course it's just not used. That's where you get the adaptive gain from Superlearner by not being married to one particular algorithm. It just chooses the best one for that particular data set. An important point for the theory and also the practice of TMLE is that the initial estimator can be very important, certainly in observational studies, for both the treatment mechanism as for the outcome regression. So you want to have a good Superlearner. You don't want to have a Superlearner with a library with a few algorithms. You want to really have powerful algorithms in there. And for that, you wonder about the theory. What do we know about these algorithms? What is their rate of convergence? Are they able to learn the truth? Now, that's where highly adaptive lasso is an algorithm we developed, which essentially says that you can write every function of vector variables, as long as it's Cadillac, right continuous left-hand limits, and has finite variations, so these are very weak assumptions. You can write it as an infinite linear combination of tensor products of spline basis functions, which are just indicators that a variable exceeds a cutoff. So it jumps from 0 to 1 at that cutoff. And that allows you, and that the variation norm of that function is then nothing else than the L1 norm of all its coefficients. And so this then says that you can actually, what you should be doing is you should be running like a minimum least squares regression or maximum likelihood over all functions, over all linear combinations of these base functions, where the under the L1 norm of the coefficient vector being constrained by a constant, which is then saying I'm going to find the best function under the constraint that the variation norm of the function is bounded by this constant. So given a certain complexity, you find the best fit to the data. This is an incredible powerful algorithm, and theoretically it has now been shown it converges at a rate n to the -1/3 up to log n factors independent of the dimension. And therefore it's always able to learn the truth at this fast rate. And then there's also a constant in front of it, and that has to do with the underlying true variation of the true function. So if the true function is not that complex, the constant is very good, and otherwise it's not so good, of course. And so by including the highly adaptive lasso in your Superlearner, you obtain a Superlearner with a great rate of convergence. Anyway, this was just some simulations by David Bankerser to compare in different dimensions how Hull is doing relative to algorithms like gradient boosting and random forest. And you see that it actually is doing very well, and actually certainly does start doing better as the dimension grows of the covariates. We can actually push the Superlearner idea. That's why we have now, so we call on Hull, highly adaptive lasso Superlearner or Metalearner, which means that when you do at the meta level, right, that's what this all comes down to. You create this data set where one column is the outcomes, but then for every outcome, the covariate columns are the candidate algorithms trained on the training sample, excluding that outcome. And so then at that moment, you have a new data set. You can think of it as a cross-validated data set. And then you say, how do I combine these candidate algorithms, which are the covariates in the data set, to get the best prediction of the outcome. That's the meta-learning step. That's finding the best way of combining the algorithms into a new prediction function. And then, of course, you can say, oh, let's just do the linear convex combination. But you can push it and say, why not run an own machine learning algorithm as a meta-learning? In other words, why not use Hull at the meta-learning level? So run an lasso essentially with all, and find the best functional combination of all these candidate algorithms under this L1 norm constraint, which itself then gets chosen with cross-validation and which does an optimal job. So you will be tuning exactly how aggressive you can be at that meta-learning level, and therefore maybe it will say, let's go very not aggressive, and then it will be more like a convex one, or it starts increasing the L1 norm to be more aggressive, all depending what works best. So in this, it creates an even more powerful algorithm. And that's called the whole meta-learner. You can prove then that also in simulations that it actually does, even can done easily, also as predicted by theory, can easily outperform then the superlearner using the convex combinations. So just a little understanding what's powerful, why does TMLE work, this targeting step. Now the idea is that you start with an offset, which is your superlearner, but then you say, okay, I'm going to do a little extra fitting, and like you do a little parametric model, which uses offset the initial estimate and then does a little fluctuation, and that has a particular fluctuation parameter. Now, like in the average treatment effect, we're adding a covariate. We use this offset the superlearner, and then we add a covariate. Now, whatever covariate you add, you will be improving the likelihood by fitting the coefficient in front of that covariate. But the key is that you add a covariate there so that you will be, again, improve that likelihood, but you will get the maximal change in the target estimate for the corresponding increase in likelihood. And so really what it's all about is, how can I find a little parametric path, like a little parametric model really with a coefficient, so that a small change in that coefficient corresponds with, in terms of unit increase in likelihood, corresponds with a maximal square change in the target estimate. That's actually how you formally also define the so-called local least favorable model. And so what it really means is that all the fitting of the data at that target step gets completely translated into changing and improving the fit of the estimate. And that's what you see here in an example of the average treatment effect. There's two targeting steps. One uses the wrong covariate, one uses the right covariate. And you see, if you compare then how they, during the targeting step, increase the likelihood and how that translates into the change in treatment effect, you see that the red one is having a much steeper slope, because it translates any change in likelihood much sharper, stronger into a change in the average treatment effect, and therefore for the same increase in likelihood, which is about what they will get, you get much closer to the truth. And so that's how this all works. Let me see. Yeah, this is about, can we actually, we can do simulations where you can say, how can I break the highly adaptive lasso target maximal likelihood estimator? And so that's something David has done, simulations where you randomly sample data distributions, you throw in any kind of complex functions for the outcome regression, for the treatment, and then start simulating from it, and then run this TMLE with first run Superlearner with maybe including all kinds of algorithms, also the highly adaptive lasso, and then see how well they actually do. And that becomes a very honest simulation where you can really see how these estimators work, and in particular, find out where the weak spots are, and then more work to do there. So in this case, the simulations you see here, they're checking actually the coverage, and they give very good coverage if you include the highly adaptive lasso in your Superlearner, even in up to dimensions 10, which is kind of remarkable for the kind of sample size we're talking about here. Okay, so I think, I don't know how we are doing on time, but I would in principle could stop here so that we have time for questions. Because if I would proceed, I would have, and this is for other people kind of happy to, they can look at the slides, but there's a lot of work on adaptive designs we are doing where you, like the example we did with the sepsis, right? Where you look at past trials, learn what would be the optimal dynamic treatment, like best estimate of the optimal dynamic treatment, and then actually start carrying it out in the next trial with randomization probabilities. starting to approximate that optimal dynamic treatment, and so on. And you get this kind of sequential adaptive trial, and you can then see that you really start performing much better as an overall system in controlling whatever you're trying to control. So here are some quick pictures where you see that a balanced design has a certain death rate. This is a percent samples following the optimal rule under these two types of designs, and the adaptive design moves towards, assigning 75% or something of the patients the optimal rule when the balance keeps giving it only to 50%. Then, of course, as a result, you also get a better percent of deaths. So you start controlling your disease better, and there's no price to pay in terms of confidence intervals. We can still get honest confidence intervals. So that's work on adaptive design. We also do work on this is about online superlearning for prediction of hypotensive episodes in patients, and then you can see how well you do, learning the past data on the patient as well and on other patients, and then making predictions for that patient. And then also you can even add to that prediction intervals, which we also have developed. And so you can do that type of stuff. And these are just examples. And that's the end. So I will stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. That was really instructive, and it's great that we've got some time for some questions and answers. So as a reminder, everyone's lines are muted, and so if you'd like to ask a question, if you type it into the Zoom Q&A feature, that would be great. I'll start us off, and then I see we've got a couple questions in the Q&A already. So I think it's clear, based on your presentation and a lot of the work that's happened over a decade now or so, that targeted learning is really an attractive subfield of statistics. And as you say, it's a really appealing goal to let the data speak for themselves versus using recipe-driven approaches, so that we can get better answers from observational data, which is really an important goal within Sentinel. So one question I have, and it's sort of based on some of my experience working with Sentinel data and questions through the years, despite the large numbers of enrollees that we often start with within the Sentinel cohort across many sites, many data partners, when we get down to asking a particular safety question with, among a certain group of people taking a particular medication, we actually can get down to relatively smaller samples. So I'm sort of wondering, for methods that want to let the data speak for themselves when there's relatively less data to speak, how does that work? Or how could you talk about the limitations in small samples?
Yeah, that's firstly, you're absolutely right. That I think what you just did, you gave an argument for also against this idea that somehow in this world of big data that we don't need real statistics anymore, and that the sample size will always be big enough. That's true for the sample mean, right? And we all agree on that. But if we care about more detailed questions, like you're already describing, that when you really dive into it, you might end up with studies maybe on 5,000 subjects. Now that's not bad, but it's not infinite, and you still have to deal with statistical inference because your questions are challenging. They try to understand causal effects. So at the end, the variance of your estimator can still be very substantial, and the bias of your estimator therefore plays a big role. But anyway, so that's an argument for saying, we do need statistical inference, even for so-called the area of big data. But going back to the question, is there a limitation of the targeted learning as a general statistical methodology with respect to sample size, that there for certain sample size it's not appropriate? And the answer is actually, from my perspective, no. And I give you an example, right? For example, we were doing this community randomized trial in Africa led by Maya Peterson, which is evaluating 2 community level interventions. One is very aggressive about testing, and then the moment a person is HIV, you bring them into care and you start treating them, and also actually, thereby obstructing infection, and nowadays also prophylaxis type things. And then the other one is more the control. What's the current standard? And so this trial lasted several years, and then, but at the end, it's 32 communities. And of course, within every community, you have like thousands up to whatever, 10,000 people. So your actual estimate of what the outcome is for that community, which is a proportion of new HIV infections, let's say, that itself is based on quite a number of subjects. It's actually still a rare outcome, but the real sample size you're dealing with is the number of communities, because we are randomizing 2 communities, and that's what you want to exploit. So this effective sample size is 32. And so what we do, but then even though it was a randomized trial, you could say, let's just take the difference, you know, you have the average of the outcome among the treated communities, and then minus the average of the outcome among the control community, and we take the difference, and that's the difference of the sample mean. Why not that, right? But then the problem was that you could tell that even though these communities were randomized, there was even some kind of adaptive pair matching going on, there were going to be very serious confounders, and they're empirical confounders, right? And with 32, you still are going to have these differences. And so the question was, what confounder shall we adjust for? And things like the overall risk profile of a community, they really differ from one to the other. They're across several countries in Africa. And so in the end, we could come up with whatever, 20 or so really strong, important confounders. But you can only adjust for maybe 1 or 2, or with a sample size of 32. And so what we did, we built a Superlearner with a library of whatever, around 15 or so algorithms, each one only putting in for the outcome regression, adjusting for 1 or 2 covariates. We then also have in the targeting step, you can there also adjust in the treatment mechanism. So that could also then, even though it's randomized, you can still fit there in an extra covariate to make it also do adjustment there. And so at the end, we could adjust for up to 3 covariates and then let the Superlearner with leave one out cross-validation figure out which one should we adjust for, right? Which one of these covariates. And so at the end, this was all a priori specified. We did simulations to really show the great benefit of this relative to just doing the difference in means. And we ran the analysis. The benefit was very important. And so here you talk about a $50 million study, sample size 32, where this type of approach, still completely honest, a priori specified, right, makes a big difference. So my point being, there's a lot of flexibility, but you do have to put care in it, right? Because we cannot do with sample size 32 a random forest, right? So you have to kind of be careful how you develop your whole target maximum likelihood estimator with all its choices. And that's kind of what we're also talking about in this project with the Sentinel, right? Is that it's not trivial always to come up with the right specification. And that's where I feel that it's smart to have some kind of outcome blind data, or to at least, make sure you get the specifications right before committing to your statistical analysis plan. Yeah,
that's right. I think it's appealing to have a method that is thinking about not just can the data speak for themselves, but which pieces, which data elements are the ones that are going to matter the most to help reduce bias the most.
Exactly. And often you don't know, and that's where this flexibility is so helpful, right? That you say, I don't need to know exactly, I just need to know what might be possible. You add them all with some sensibility, and you have then a lot of flexibility still to let the data figure it out, even with that small sample size.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question from Jonathan Geller, and I'm going to go ahead and read it. Can TMLE be used for observational studies when you're worried about selection on unobservables?
Yeah, no, that's so I think what I hear here is suppose you have an observational study, you care about some causal effect, let's say of a treatment and on an outcome, but in that study, the treatment decisions, let's say maybe made by the doctor or maybe by the person himself, because it's some kind of exposure, is based on variables you don't measure, right? And so the point is this, think about the roadmap. You still have to go through the roadmap, and you say, okay, I do care about that causal effect, but now I don't have all the variables measured. I need to be able to identify this causal quantity. So I have a causal gap. That doesn't mean you cannot say, I still think this estimate, like for example, the estimate of the average treatment effect, I still don't use it. It's the best I can do. It's the best approximation I can get of the desired average causal effect given the data set I have. You're very aware of it. You know about the unmeasured confounders. It would be better if you can actually find a way to collect them. We all get that. But as a way of moving forward, you can still say, no, I'm going for this estimate anyway. And TMLE has nothing to do with causal inference. It's a statistical estimation problem, a statistical estimator. So then TMLE is then a great methodology for estimating an estimate and getting inference for the estimate. So you will get good confidence interval for the estimate. There still is then the problem of interpretation, right? You can then interpret this as saying, yeah, really what I found was, and within all the strata of the covariates, if you look at the difference in death rates, and then you among the treated and the control, and you average, you get this. I cannot claim it's causal, but it's darn interesting because maybe I already see there is no effect left. Or maybe I see, wow, there's still a lot left, right? So you're learning. It's not that you didn't learn anything. You still learn, right? And then, but you still have to be careful in your interpretation by not over-interpreting it. And so that's why a lot of progress can be made in science by going after statistical estimates, which are not necessarily causal. But it's still important to understand what you're doing and that it is not causal and that you understand the limitations. And therefore also are motivated for more research of finding, being able to collect these variables you might need.
Yeah, and that's very true within Sentinel, where we're collecting data that are not being collected for research purposes. And so the caveats with regard to interpretation are important as we produce estimates of anything and make decisions based on them.
Exactly, exactly.
So
that's
another,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, good. We've got two more questions I'd like to see if we can get to from the audience. One is, could you please explain what are the differences and similarities between IPTW, doubly robust IPTW, and TMLE?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about. I mean, firstly, generally speaking, IPTW is a way for a particular class of problems to construct estimators. Right? TMLE is general. There's nothing to do with. We can use it for anything, right? We can use it for estimating the integral of the density squared or whatever. It's nothing to do with causal inference. It just I work in a field where often people care about causal effects, and that's why we employ TMLE for that purpose. But it's not. It's a pure statistical estimation problem. But IPTW is for this particular class of problems, like sensor data problems or these kind of causal inference problems, is a attractive estimator because from the point of view, it's kind of, I can just run my standard regression and I put in weights, that kind of thing. So it's attractive from that perspective, but it's an inefficient estimator. It doesn't utilize all the data, and it's relatively unstable estimator. So it has often large variance. So yes, attractive if you want something quick, but not a great overall methodology. Then there are ways to improve it, but by the more non-parametric you estimate this treatment mechanism or the inverse probability sensing, the more efficient it will get. We have some work ongoing actually where we use highly adaptive lasso to learn the treatment mechanism. Then it actually you can make it a fully efficient estimator. But that's one thing. And also in general, it's not a plug-in estimator, so it could be having some robustness issues from that perspective. Then you're talking about double robust. Now again, double robust is not itself. It has to do with the class of estimation problems. There are certain statistical estimation problems defined by a model and a target estimate, which allow double robust estimation. That has nothing to do with the choice of estimate. That has to do with that the statistical estimation problem has a property. You can actually, it's characterized by the so-called exact second order remainder. If you read my work, you can define your target parameter, which is a mapping from the distribution of the data to the real line. That has a second order expansion. You can write this parameter at P minus the parameter at the true P0 as in terms of the first order derivative, which is in terms of the canonical gradient. And then there is a remainder. And that is an exact remainder. You can work it out in every problem. That remainder sometimes has the structure that it's like an integral of outcome regression minus true outcome regression times propensity score estimator minus true propensity score. So it has this product of differences. So therefore, that remainder has a very nice structure. And that's a double robust structure, meaning if one of them is zero, the whole thing is zero, which is very different from a second order remainder, which behaves like an integral of like a density estimator minus true density squared. That is never there's no cancellation there. And so there are statistical estimation problems out there where this exact remainder of the target parameter has a beautiful structure, like double robust, but sometimes more involved. Like you have all kinds of terms, and some are product of this and this, and another is a product of that and that. So you get all these pairs of creating where the remainder would still be 0 under these different levels of combinations of incorrect specification. Anyway, so that's purely a property of a statistical estimation problem. And it's true that, for example, for the average treatment effect, of many, and actually most causal inference and sense and data problems, we do have that double robust structure. Meaning, if you either get the censoring or the treatment mechanism right, or you get the relevant parts of the likelihood right, you are going to have that remainder small. That doesn't mean you should not invest in both, because you want that remainder real small, right? You want it to be that it becomes negligible. So that's why you still want to invest in both parts of the likelihood and do a good job. And that's why Superlearner still plays an absolutely key role there. So that's, and anyway, and then you say, but then there are different estimators of fully exploiting that double robustness. And these are the efficient estimators. And among the efficient estimator, there's TMLE, and then there's also things like estimating equation-based estimators, where you write down the so-called efficient image curve as an estimating function, you solve it, right? There's a whole area of research which started with Robin Zrodnitsky. We have a book on it with Jamie. And then there's the one-step estimator, which is the most classical efficient estimator. Now, the one-step estimator is just like, you can think of very close to the estimating equation methodologies, like the first step of a Newton-Raphson, if you want, and TMLE. Now, both are double robust, right? TMLE is double robust. Any efficient estimator will be double robust if the estimation problem allows that, has that structure. And then the benefit of TMLE versus the estimating equation-based, which is what you probably refer to, like augmented IPCW, is a variety of things. But in particular, like I said, it's a substitution estimator, and therefore it will always, if it estimates a probability or a difference of probability, it will always respect that. So it will not end up with a negative number or bigger than this. And that becomes particularly important when the problem has positivity issues, right? When there is challenges, right? Because of propensity scores getting close to 0 or censoring happening with high probability. That's in these situations where there's sparsity and there's a challenge for really using the data to get a stable, robust estimator. That's where then TMLE is significantly more robust than these estimating equation-based estimators or the one-step estimator. But there are actually advantages far beyond just that. There are things like collaborative target mix and likelihood estimation, all kinds of things we can do within the TMLE framework, because we do have a likelihood, we do have always a uniquely defined estimate. We can use that likelihood to optimize things like the estimation of the propensity score or the censoring. And so there are all kinds of things we can do within the TMLE framework you cannot even do, right? There's also double robust inference estimator, double robust inference TMLE. You can only do with TMLE. It goes back to work by David Bengus and Marco, and originally a paper by me, where we show that you can actually, even when you misspecify, like the outcome regression or the treatment mechanism, you can, by extra targeting, you can arrange that within the TMLE framework. The estimator remains asymptotically linear, while normally that's not true. You start losing the asymptotic linearity, even though you still have the consistency under the double robust framework. Anyway, that's the overall short answer. Long answer.
So we are at the top of the hour. We have a number of questions that are remaining, and we can perhaps talk about whether or not we could work to get some answers to those offline afterward. But I just want to thank you again, Mark, for presenting today. Another reminder.
Feel free to send me these questions, and I can send them, and you can post them somewhere.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. A reminder that the session has been recorded and will be available through the Sentinel webpage, and you can also find details and registration links for future Innovation Center webinars on the website sentinelinitiative.org. This concludes our session for today, and we hope to see you again next time. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you.